Hello and welcome to the 8th episode of the series A Closer Look on Kyrgyzstan. My name is Simona Grano and I am Senior Lecturer and Director of the Taiwan Studies Project at the University of Zurich. A Closer Look is a series by the Asian Society Switzerland with the support of BDO and the Institute of Asian and Oriental Studies at the University of Zurich, shedding light on different Asian countries through the eyes of leading local voices. Kyrgyzstan is a mountainous, landlocked country in Central Asia, bordering on Kazakhstan, China, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. 90% of the country is actually dominated by massive, rugged mountain ranges, and that is why the country has also earned the nickname of the Switzerland of Central Asia. The Kyrgyz people make up nearly 3/4 of the population, followed by the Uzbeks and other smaller ethnic minorities. After the Kyrgyz language, the most widely understood language is actually Russian, which is spoken by nearly half of the population according to a census dating back to the year 2009. The official language status has actually been accorded to both Kyrgyz as well as Russian. Islam is the major religion of Kyrgyzstan, with about 90% of the population being Muslim. Kyrgyzstan Human Development Index, a measure generated by the UN, ranks 120th out of 189 countries. Now, just as a basic information, a country scores higher HDI when the lifespan in the country is higher, the education level is higher, and the gross national income, GNI, per capita is higher. And for you to compare, in this respect, Kyrgyzstan is considerably better off than, for example, Pakistan, which we looked at in the 6th episode of this series. Nevertheless, compared to other former Soviet republics, Kyrgyzstan's standard of living and educational and economic levels are actually among the lowest. Let me now give you some basic information on the geography and the economic sector. Kyrgyzstan, great distance from the oceans and the sharp changes of elevation actually strongly influence the country's climate. And the climate does vary immensely depending on the region, from subtropical to polar. The people of Kyrgyzstan have traditionally raised livestock and have engaged in farming. And by the late 20th century, the republic had become a source for non-ferrous metals and a producer of machinery, light industrial products, hydroelectric power, and food products. Gold mining has increased in importance, and Kyrgyzstan possesses substantial coal reserves and some petroleum and natural gas deposits. Excuse me. Kyrgyzstan has a GDP per capita of about $1,200. And as you can see on the graph, this number is comparable to Pakistan's. It is somewhat lower than Uzbekistan's and considerably lower than, for instance, Kazakhstan's, Central Asia's richest country. Now, about 30% of Kyrgyzstan GDP is made up by remittances, making it the 3rd most remittance dependent country in the world. Over 90% of the remittances actually come from migrant workers in Russia, a topic we'll address later on with our guest. And due to its heavy dependence on the remittances and gold production, the Kyrgyz economy is actually quite vulnerable to external shocks. Let me now give you some context on the history and on the contemporary era. The area that is now Kyrgyzstan became part of the Qing dynasty, as all of you know, the last dynasty in the imperial history of China, in the mid-18th century, and then came under Russian control in the 19th century. Kyrgyzstan's long rebellion against Russia first, and later the Soviet Union, which began in 1916, actually resulted in a long period of brutal repression, the rebellion against Russia, I meant. So in 1991, Kyrgyzstan gained independence as the Soviet Union collapsed and disintegrated, and under the leadership of President Askar Akayev, the country actually became one of the most democratic states in Central Asia region. Nevertheless, Kyrgyzstan has since then on and off struggled with creating a democratic process and with establishing a stable economy. Systemic corruption and economic problems actually have been for a long time major stress factors underlying a series of revolts. that have deposed presidents in 2005, in 2010, and most recently in 2020. In 2020, the elections returned an overwhelming victory to pro-government political parties and raging opposition groups. The crisis emerged in the context of severe social and economic emergencies resulting from the first wave of COVID-19 and the inability of the parliament to actually adequately address crucial social, economic, and health-related issues. After former President Emilbek resigned, new elections in January 2021 brought to power populist nationalist Sadir Yaparov, who had just been liberated from prison by his supporters. After 10 years as Central Asia's only parliamentary republic, Kyrgyzstan reinstated the presidential form of government, and the new constitution actually further solidified the president's authority. We'll talk about all that with our guest today, which I would now like to introduce. His name is Dr. Emilbek Dzhuraev. He's a political scientist and an analyst based in Kyrgyzstan. His research and teaching areas actually include geopolitics, international relations and security pertaining to Central Asia, as well as issues of democracy, state building, and constitutionalism in Central Asia. He has taught in political science programs at the American University of Central Asia and at the OSCE Academy in Bishkek. He is also a co-founder and fellow of Crossroads Central Asia, a Bishkek-based think tank. Welcome, Emil. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much for having me. It is a great pleasure to be with you.
Good. So let me start the conversation with some standardized question, right? To which your answers should be, I remind you, rather brief, but we'll have plenty of time today. So if I had to ask you a question, a very general one, where do you see today Kyrgyzstan's strength and what fascinates you most about your country? And at the opposite of that, what concerns you most about that? What would you tell me?
Very trying to be brief. What fascinates me about Kyrgyzstan is that it has been persevering through recurring cycles of challenges, especially political, but also economic, social, and whatnot. And what fascinates me, especially in particular, is to see that Kyrgyzstan, just like you gave some economic statistics, is among the poorer countries in the region, internationally, but also when you see outside in the city of Bishkek, you see all the expensive cars, rather all right infrastructure for the urban setup, and it's just amazing how it is possible for the society to live like that with a given economic stance. Okay. And the concern is really how we're going to carry on in the surrounding rather authoritarian, rather hostile politically environment, but we'll talk more about that.
Sure, we actually have the whole main part of this conversation, which is going to deal precisely with this topic. So thank you for the first question. And I'd like to proceed by asking you, again, in a rather brief manner, and I know you can actually pick and choose between these three I'm giving you, but if you only had a few words, how would you judge the current state of your country regarding society, politics, and the economy? I'm aware it's a very difficult question to answer in brief words. You can also pick and choose only one.
I can very briefly say about each. The society, I'd say, is a very plural, diverse society, which has been becoming, unfortunately, rather divided, especially on political, ideological, identity matters. Politics has been, as it happens very much with Kyrgyzstan, a rather turbulent, dynamic process. We're undergoing changes again. And the economy, like the rest of the world and the region, is in a crisis, and it's expected to be even getting worse.
Amazing that you have managed to answer all three and in a concise but also very widespread and interesting way. Thank you for that. So on the same note, what is the biggest misconception you feel that people have against Kyrgyzstan or about Kyrgyzstan?
I could not think of a single misconception. I think there are at least 3 or 4 maybe. One is very often I hear among non-specialists at least that Kyrgyzstan is viewed or understood as this monolithic Muslim society, like many other stands. Kyrgyzstan, like several of the other stands as well, is actually a diverse society where religion is part of it, increasing part of it, but it's far from being the only game in town. Secondly, I think we'll talk more about this, is that it's viewed rather congratulatorily as an island of democracy, but I think that's a already problematic statement. We'll talk more about that. A very small thing is that Kyrgyzstan is viewed as, is misheard or mispronounced as Kurdistan. Kurdistan being so far a non-sovereign region of a national group in the northwest of Iraq, part of Turkey. But I think we'll speak more about all of this.
Absolutely, yes. We'll talk about that more in detail during the main part of the conversation. But briefly, do you think you could also sort of like compare Kyrgyzstan and tell us where you see it in comparison to some of the neighboring countries? I'm thinking of Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, China. You can also just, as I said, pick and choose just one or two.
I think it's best to understand Kyrgyzstan as indeed as compared to the neighboring countries, to what we usually refer to Central Asia, with 5 formerly Soviet countries, the ones that you just said. Among all of them, I'd say Kyrgyzstan is at the same time both the most free and most liberal society, as well as politics, and one of the, if not the poorest, then at least well-performing economically, at least in macroeconomic results. And I think that really sort of, the two are somewhat interrelated, which distinguishes it from the other countries, especially Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, the larger countries.
Okay, great. I actually thank you for that. I look forward to really hearing more in depth about the misconception regarding the democratic system, and yet the fact that you do actually have just told us now, and will tell us more later in detail, that your country actually is to a certain extent much better off in terms of freedom of the press and so on and so forth. I really look forward to that. But let us maybe have some information on you so that the public and myself can actually understand what is your perspective on your home country. Maybe that you can tell us something about your own background.
Your generous introduction actually said all the most important things about me personally. I can just say I'm just a representative, a rather typical mainstream representative of Kyrgyzstan, except that probably I got most of my education in the United States that might introduce some nuances to my views on things. But other than that, I come from a very remote part of and provincial part of Kyrgyzstan, on the southwestern tip of the map that you just showed.
Okay, that's great. I also look forward to hear more, if we have time, about other people in your, for example, profession, whether they have gone to study in Russia or other places, or like yourself in America. But certainly, let me now, sorry?
There are indeed those groups of people, some who studied in Russia, some who were in the West, some in Turkey, and the rest here in Kyrgyzstan.
A very diverse group of people. So I would suggest, Emil, if it's okay for you, that we now enter the more in-depth part of our conversation, which is actually structured around 3 big topics. The first one being democracy, and of course democracy in Kyrgyzstan, which we have already partially addressed, but we look forward to actually hear much more. And to that extent, as we said before, Kyrgyzstan has been hailed as the most democratic country in Central Asia. You talked about that when you said there's also a misconception about that. And occasionally it has also been referred as an island of democracy. Now, I'd like to ask you, can you tell us, first of all, how is it that Kyrgyzstan gained this reputation, and what distinguishes Kyrgyzstan from other countries in Central Asia in this regard?
Yes, I think that nickname of an island of democracy was given Kyrgyzstan at the very earliest stages of independence. As you mentioned in your introductory notes, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. and 15 new countries emerged. And Kyrgyzstan in this region, in Central Asia, I think was the only country where the sitting incumbent leader under the Soviet Union had to leave. So we got a new president, Askar Akayev, by the end of 1990. And because he was not really part of this establishment, Communist Party establishment, and did not have a strong basis among the insider political nomenclature, he was more open to serious changes. So by early 1990s already, Kyrgyzstan was by far the more far-reaching and the faster liberalizing political regime, both economically and politically. So instead of, for example, the Soviet-run model of a state-controlled economy, very centralized economy, Kyrgyzstan embarked on fast-paced privatization and market-based economy. It was a very difficult time for the society, but we had to take the pill, as it were. And politically, almost overnight, the Communist Party lost its monopoly on the political field. Political party pluralism was opened up, and very soon we had many scores of parties. By now we have maybe some 300 parties. Many of them are not really active, but there is a very wide diversity of political groupings. And both of these, the economic and political directions of changes, are in stark contrast to neighboring countries, where all the others, compared to Kyrgyzstan, took a very slow pace of development. Tajikistan, unfortunately, entered a war, a civil war. Uzbekistan essentially tried to keep everything the way the Soviet Union was. And Kazakhstan was was liberalizing and changing, but at a much slower pace than Kyrgyzstan. But we have to just say that early pace and early directions and scope of changes did not hold for very long in Kyrgyzstan.
I will ask you exactly that in a few seconds, but since you also mentioned Kazakhstan, we have also a part on that and the most recent protest that we have witnessed in January, of course. But maybe just one last question, since you actually said, that this is something that makes Kyrgyzstan, or has, especially in the past, launched a very quick sort of like opening up, and then maybe the sort of like stabilizing part has not really followed through. Can you maybe tell us something whether, other countries, especially your neighboring countries, see Kyrgyzstan as an island of democracy where, for example, they have more rights in terms of freedom of expression? Does that also, for example, mean that you attract civil society from elsewhere in the region?
Yeah, that's a very important thing in Kyrgyzstan. Now, if you can only imagine, actually, for anywhere, for a country to be a distinctly and significantly more democratic and free society, and be surrounded by clearly authoritarian, closed, repressive regimes, that's a very tall order. It's a very difficult thing to maintain. And so Kyrgyzstan's part of the story of changing political dynamics in Kyrgyzstan might be because it started out as that island surrounded by authoritarianism. But so when we think of how Kyrgyzstan is viewed from outside among the neighbors, I think indeed Kyrgyzstan is definitely viewed as a much freer, open society by civil society, by pro-democracy groups in the other countries. Very often they tend to be either underground or in exile or self-exile, or at least have to be very cautious in their own countries. And they recognize that Kyrgyzstani colleagues of theirs do not have the same restraints that they have to experience on a daily basis. Now, obviously, the governments of the other countries view Kyrgyzstan with great suspicion and would often prefer to point at Kyrgyzstan and say that's a country of instability, a country of anarchy, and a bad example generally. And I think that sort of, lets one understand what sort of an object or example Kyrgyzstan is for the neighbors.
All right. Okay. Thank you. That was actually very interesting. And you mentioned some of the points I would like to go more in depth. And this is related to the political instability. So we know that the country has seen 2 decades, I've mentioned it in the introduction, of political instability, with 3 revolutions ending in the removal of a president, right? After current president, you mentioned it before, Sadir Japarov came to power last year. He actually implemented constitutional reforms which returned the country from a parliamentary system to a presidential form of government. And this, as far as I've read, has raised concern of backsliding into authoritarianism. So my first question for you would be, how do you judge the current situation in Kyrgyzstan? Can we say that it still is an island of democracy? And also, as far as I know, Yaparov promised to launch an anti-corruption crackdown. Have you seen any signs of change in that regard?
It's a difficult process. So indeed, you brought us to the most recent developments in Kyrgyzstan. And when I said earlier in our brief answers about misconceptions about Kyrgyzstan, I meant to say that when, without any qualifications and backstory of what the island of democracy has been, one might imagine that Kyrgyzstan is an established, well-functioning, liberal, electoral democracy and whatnot. Now, the true story is that it's been a very unstable, often changing process. I can maybe just start by giving some numbers. So in the 30 years so far that we've had, Sadir Japarov is the 7th country president. Of them, the 6th, that is, the 6th president. And of the previous presidents, only one is peacefully at home in Kyrgyzstan going forward. That's Miss Rosa Otunbayeva, the only woman leader we had following the 2010 revolution in April. 2 presidents happen to be mostly on the run outside the country ever since they were kicked out of power. And one former president has been behind bars after leaving office. And one, the penultimate, the most recently exited president, has to keep silent. It was basically a part of political bargain that he's able to stay as long as he doesn't have too much of a political presence in the country. We've also had about 10 different occasions of constitutional changes. In 2021, we had the most recent one, which, as you rightly mentioned, put Kyrgyzstan back into a very centralized presidential form of government. But it's been changing a lot. And we've just, at the end of 2021, we elected the 7th convocation of parliament. And the notable thing about the parliament is that nearly each of these convocations from 1st to the 7th has been elected under different legal foundations, into a different structure of the parliament, under different rules for political parties, etc. So when you take all of these and some other facts about these 30 years of independence, you see that Kyrgyzstan has really been mildly putting in a very dynamic process of political change. And most recently, as of these changes in 2021, when Sadir Japarov, at the beginning of the year, he got elected and got official legitimacy of presidency, he introduced some very far-reaching changes, including the constitution. And as a result, indeed, Kyrgyzstan has been not really an island of democracy anymore.
Okay. Yeah.
We can certainly say that it may be not an island, but a peninsula of greater freedom, greater civic freedom, still greater political competitiveness, greater political pluralism, but compared to other neighbors, right? But it certainly has backtracked from actual democratic practices.
I see.
It has also been a process where, and by the way, Kyrgyzstan in many years, Kyrgyzstan was always ranked among, for example, Freedom House Index as partly free. This latest, most recent ranking put it under unfree category, like the rest of the region.
Right.
Yeah. And to your question about this anti-corruption, that's part of the problems and part of probably a reason why Kyrgyzstan has been so politically unstable and changing is also about very far-reaching corruption.
Yeah.
Political, from everyday corruption to the highest level.
Right.
And,
I mean, that's
right.
That's an endemic problem, of course. We also see that in many other countries where you have anti-corruption campaign launched by Xi Jinping in China in 2013, and it can go both ways, right? It can be also a way to oust your political rivals, especially in a system which you have just explained is backsliding slowly towards authoritarianism. Thank you very much, Emil. I'd like to move, if it's okay for you, to the next topic. This is the next big block. It's about the influence of the past on the present. And to that regard, I'd like to ask you a question. Now, it has been 3 decades since Kyrgyzstan and other former Soviet republics in the region became independent, as we said, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Would you say that the country has successfully transitioned to a market-based economy?
I think that's one area where we can say definitely change has happened in the 30 years. That is, the economy is very much a market-based, non-state-run economy, where if at the very beginning in 1991, the entire economy was essentially owned and run by the state. Today, maybe about 20% of the economy is state-owned. Obviously, economic regulation is still there, but it is very much a market-based economy with private enterprise making up the greatest part of economic livelihood of the society, from agriculture to tourism, to services sector, to banking and production, in all areas, I think. And only the traditionally so-called natural monopoly or quasi-natural monopoly areas, such as electricity and energy provision or public infrastructure, those are where the state still is either the owner or the controlling actor. And I think it's also actually, I like to think, is an achievement where Kyrgyzstan can be, well, at least certainly take as a positive this change, where the people are not looking for the state anymore for their daily, regular subsistence. People, whether they are the poorer people, the rich, everyone understands they are in charge of their economic well-being in their households, and that's a great change, I think, that has taken place.
Thank you for that. And I'm sure that the kind of process that you have just described must also have had an impact on society. So can you maybe tell us how the Kyrgyz society has changed with these economic reforms, and also whether there are still some aspects of Soviet life that are actually retained or that people miss in Kyrgyzstan?
To begin about the missing part, definitely there's a lot of missing of the Soviet times, especially by the older generations who have seen the Soviet Union. I got to see about 12 years of Soviet Union, but among these elder generations, of course, there is, especially with 30 years in between, everybody only remembers the good things, I think, or most people. But as I said, people have changed, and this entrepreneurial spirit, the ability and the readiness to take financial responsibility for their own lives. I think that has been changing a lot. The society, the makeup of the society has also changed over time, not necessarily because of the economic changes, but overall because the country became independent. And many things, the demographics have changed a lot. Kyrgyzstan used to have a much greater percentage of ethnic Russian population at the beginning. By now, I think it makes up maybe 1/5 or 1/4 of that ratio of Russian or Russian-speaking population. Kyrgyzstan is also, the society sees a much greater presence of religion, for example. Of course, as people might know, Soviet Union was essentially an atheist, non-religious society. And religion has definitely come back very much, which is not to say that everybody actually practices religion, but there is a much greater percentage, much larger number of people who do so, which you would not see, for example, even 15 or 20 years ago.
That would have been actually my next question, but partly you have already answered it, whether all of these changes and processes have also brought back or sort of like changed people's beliefs and values. I mean, partly you have talked about the religious aspect, rituals coming back into daily life. What about people's values? Do you see some changes there with this long-standing process of change?
I think in terms of values, it's been a society in flux, in a changing time, I think, not just because of independence, but also because of global changes that's been occurring throughout the world. I think, as I said, religion has been seeing a serious rise, and within that, I must also note, Islam is obviously a rather diverse religion in itself, just like Christianity, and Kyrgyzstan has certainly several varieties and different forms of practice of Islam, even. So there's, even within Islam, there is no monolithic nature to it.
Sure.
And there is also so-called re-traditionalization process. A lot of people note that. So trying to look back into the roots, cherish the older, sometimes even mythical sort of national history, but generally turning to greater sort of nationalist sentiments, and of course some number among the society are going into this more cosmopolitan and liberal views as well. So you have a wide variety of views going on in the society.
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, I guess there's always this sort of return to some forms of even traditions from the past or things that were banned for a long time, especially to unify people again after you don't have ideology anymore to do that, right?
Actually, I might mention this one thing that gets mentioned a lot within the Kyrgyz society when they complain about the state of affairs in the society. A lot of people think what we are missing is one unifying ideology. And I think that's because we had the habit of having one ideology, the communist, in the Soviet times. So the people, the generation who have seen that, they think that's what we need today. But obviously, Kyrgyzstan is certainly one country where, even among the Central Asian other neighbors today, there's one country that's missing any single ideology, and I think it's a good thing.
Absolutely, me too. But that's why some authoritarian regimes turn to nationalism, right, to substitute partially. Yeah. Let us actually, since we're already talking about nationalism, authoritarian regimes, and such, let me ask you a question that sets Kyrgyzstan in the world, and especially in its relationship with Russia and China. Now, the one question, of course, we all would like to hear from you, what you think is, what is the impact of the current Russia-Ukraine war on your country so far? And how do you think the people perceive it? And how has the government responded, given, of course, the fact that you, just like Ukraine, were part of the Soviet Empire?
Yes, the war in Ukraine is is having a lot of impact, and it's expected to have even greater impact as we move forward. Kyrgyzstan is among the very few handful of countries which is very closely tied to Moscow, to Russia, politically, economically, strategically, and so on. Among the society, there is a large percentage of people who are very pro-Russian, or I must even say pro-Putin. So regardless of what's actually going on the ground in Ukraine, they're ready to simply support Putin because they like Putin. We also have an actual very serious concern is the labor population who have migrated to Russia. And they send money back to Kyrgyzstan, and that makes up almost 1/3 of the annual economy. And so as soon as every time Russia gets into a serious crisis, Kyrgyzstan feels it almost immediately. And this time, of course, we expect Russia to go into a very serious crisis. And almost from the very first days when Russian ruble, the currency, started to plummet, here in Kyrgyzstan, our currency, the som, also did the same. Briefly, ruble became cheaper, but I think it will be catching up every time. But the dollars and euros became much more expensive. And that essentially means the actual volume, actual worth of money in Kyrgyzstan is going to be going down, just like in Russia. And that will lead to inflation and so on. So this is just the economic consequences. Now, politically, there is even greater sort of sensitivity and challenge that the government will have to tread very carefully. There are certainly very active voices among the civil society calling on the government to speak out in defense of Ukraine and in criticism of Russian aggressive action. But as I said, there are also the other sides.
But are these voices in the government calling out, for example, for more support for Ukraine, or in the general public and civil society?
The government, the political class in Kyrgyzstan tends to be, has to be very, very careful. Like I said, because in Kyrgyzstan, I mean, almost everybody has to deal with counterparts in Moscow very closely. They are very careful not to upset Russia as much as they can. So just yesterday, for example, Kyrgyzstan's president was speaking in front of the parliament and addressing the question. He said something to the effect that we cannot stop the war in Ukraine, and therefore we have to keep neutral. He said that in Kyrgyz, and as soon as the word war came out, his staff tried to mitigate that and tried to say that from Kyrgyz it translates as conflict, not war. So that much carefulness seems to be the rule for the Kyrgyz political class. But among the society, there is a much wider and more outspoken views, including, for example, there were several several instances of protests in front of the Russian embassy, calling to stop the war. So those things are going on.
Okay, well, I guess it absolutely makes sense. Also, given the past, also that accommodates, Kyrgyzstan and the Soviet Union and Russia, that there is this kind of split attitude. And I guess that would bring me, before we turn to China, to my next question, which is about Kazakhstan, right? I mean, we have all seen in the West as well the protests that took place, of course, in January in Kazakhstan. And I was wondering if you could tell us something about the reaction in your country to what happened there, and especially how did the government react, or the people react to the Collective Security Treaty Organization coalition appeal, and to the fact that Russia actually did send troops to Kazakhstan, right?
Yes, it's a very, so the year has started really in a crazy way in the region. Now, for Kyrgyzstan, the events in Kazakhstan were very immediate because indeed Kazakhstan is one of our closest neighbors. Culturally, the Kyrgyz and the Kazakh are also possibly the two closest nations, but politically we have our differences. So when the earliest protests started in Kazakhstan, a lot of Kyrgyzstani citizens cheered on them and tried to speak in favor, in support of the protesters, expressing sort of wishes of successful revolution so that Kazakhstan also democratizes and gets a proper accountable leadership there. But as soon as the protests turned into violence and a lot of things occurred, of course, there was a divided opinion in Kyrgyzstan. Now, the upsetting thing about those events were how the official rhetoric in Kazakhstan to explain away the events was partly to blame foreign nationals who have come and committed terrorism and burglary and looting in Kazakhstan. And among them, there were events of fake blaming of Kyrgyz citizens who were just randomly caught and then blamed for some of these actions. Of course, several of them were identified as to be completely wrong and random. And there was no evidence of actually anybody engaging in those illegal acts from Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan was also the only country among the 6 members of CSTO, which you mentioned. So for those who don't know, Collective Security Treaty Organization is Russian-led, Russian organized security organization. And when the Kazakh leadership requested help, I think Kyrgyzstan was the only country where there were loud groups of protesters, citizens who did not want to send troops there. And the main reason was, we do not want to be engaging in bloodshed of our brotherly citizens. But the government sent a small unit anyway, because they couldn't stay out of the Russian-led operation, I thought. And thankfully it ended quickly and they all came back. But the CSTO is one major concern these days when everybody in Central Asia is thinking whether Russia will request support in Ukraine via CSTO. And that would certainly meet serious opposition among the Kyrgyz society.
Okay, thank you very much. That was actually a very far-reaching, interesting reply from you. And I guess you have shown us how the Russian influence or even the fear of offending Russia is still very much present for obvious reasons. So we're actually soon going to be opening the floor to your questions for the public, but let me then ask you about the other big brother in the region, right? Which could also be very problematic, because if you already have Russian influence, I would like to ask you, how is Chinese influence interpreted? And also, I mean, I've heard about anti-Chinese sentiments in Central Asia, not necessarily in Kyrgyzstan, but in general in Central Asia, due to concerns about, for example, China's growing economic presence with the Belt and Road Initiative and the treatment of its Uyghur population, right? Can you tell us something, given your strong economic ties, about this ambivalent relationship that you have with both superpowers, right? Especially in this case, China.
Yeah, well, there is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was initiated by China and is co-led by Russia, but essentially it's more of a China-dominated organization. And the organization was initially in 1995 established specifically for China to have sort of a stable forum where it can run its policy with Central Asian countries, especially regarding this Eastern Chinese borderlands, Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Republic in particular. Now, since then, of course, we've seen a series of outbursts of protests and problems, and most recently, of course, these camps in China. But through SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and as well through different other bilateral interactions, China has successfully gotten the leaderships, the political classes in Central Asia to avoid the topic of Xinjiang. We actually, there are not just Uyghur, but there are also ethnic Kyrgyz in Xinjiang Autonomous Republic, about 100,000 or so. I think Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan are the two countries which have sizable co-ethnic minorities in Xinjiang. And because of that, indeed, there were initially, when we saw this latest Xinjiang concerns coming up in public, there were a series of protests and public reaction, demonstrations, demanding the government to actually do something and get our the Uyghurs and the Kyrgyz and Kazakhs to get their rights protected and respected. But it all came to silence over time. And in the midst of all of this, China has also developed a major economic link with Kyrgyzstan and the others. Now, Kyrgyzstan has for our economic condition, I think it's a burdensome foreign debt burden. And of that foreign debts, over 40% is to China. So the entire, all of the rest of the countries and foreign international institutions amount to less than 60% of Kyrgyzstan's foreign debt. So that means we have a serious liability, financial liability with Beijing, which makes, again, politically, the government of Kyrgyzstan very constrained. And beyond all of that, of course, we have to just remember that Kyrgyzstan is a very small country with immediate border, sharing a border with China, and there are all sorts of serious concerns, both in terms of xenophobic concerns, but also simply out of little knowledge about this very immediate and giant neighbor. So that's certainly
okay, thank you very much. I would like to continue on this note as the topic interests me very much, but I think we should be fair and open the floor to the questions of the audience. And I would actually have one for you, which you partially have just addressed, but to remain on the same note, this person would like to know a bit more about how Kyrgyzstan situates itself in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative specifically. So not just the 40% dependence, but also really what role do you play in that project?
Kyrgyzstan has signed on to Belt and Road Initiative of China from the very beginning, and that debt, 40% debt, which I said, has gone or is partly made up of large-scale Chinese investments in infrastructure development in Kyrgyzstan, especially energy sector and roads construction. BRI itself generally has been somewhat of an enigmatic project. I mean, there's an ever-going debate of what actually is part of BRI and which is not. What is not. Now, in Kyrgyzstan, generally it's been considered correct to include all of these major projects of road and energy and electricity transmission and electricity generation projects as part of BRI. Now, one thing that Kyrgyzstan has been very much interested in, which has not been happening, is a railroad project, China, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan railroad project. That would essentially link up Kyrgyzstan, a landlocked small country, to European markets to the West, between China and the West. Now, for various reasons, including geopolitical reasons, that has just not been happening. Both China and Uzbekistan remain interested in it, as just as Kyrgyzstan, but apparently other routes have been given greater priority until now. So by now, I think in terms of BRI projects, Kyrgyzstan being somewhat enthusiastic about it, has generally been only getting these burdensome investments and not quite the connectivity, which ought to be the biggest part of BRI.
Okay. Right. So, well, now I would like to ask you one question, which is on a very different note, but actually nears us to the final part of our conversation, which will also be a bit more about lighter question. This person would like to know, what's your favorite holiday in Kyrgyzstan and how do you celebrate and the Kyrgyz people that day?
My favorite holiday is Nowruz. It is coming up in less than 2 weeks. March 21st. It's I think it's generally known as the Vernal Equinox, when the day and night is equal. And in a lot of countries in Central Asia, from Iran to Azerbaijan and all the Central Asian countries, it's celebrated as this New Year. Now, it's a very kind, very warm sort of holiday, which I think was gained great popularity after independence. In the Soviet Union, of course, it was not celebrated. Now, quite disturbingly, this holiday has been resented by a lot of very serious Muslims as a non-Muslim holiday, because originally it's a Zoroastrian holiday, I guess, but it's become a sort of a very localized tradition, which I really hope we're able to keep.
Okay, well, there's one final question which I'd like to bring in, which brings us a bit back to the topic of geopolitics. And that is, over the last few years, the relationship between China and Russia, especially now we hear that a lot, seems to be getting closer. And this person would like to know if this could sort of like, if Central Asia and especially Kyrgyzstan could become a point of contention for the two countries, the influence that they sort of like try to extend on Central Asia and Kyrgyzstan.
Well, actually, I must say, when I just mentioned this ever ongoing talk about China, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan railroad project, I must say part of the reason why it's never taking place is because Russia is not interested in that alternative route, which would bypass Russia, of course. But other than that, again, we've always had this triad of major powers, including the United States from far away, especially when it was still present in Afghanistan. That Central Asia is in the middle of these three major contesting powers. And when sometimes we're able to sort of remain in balance among the competing interests of the three, at other times, of course, there's always a worry that because these different countries have sort of overlapping interests in Central Asia, we might not be able to get the most of their large markets as well as their region, their interests. Now, as we see the developments today with Ukraine and Russia under heavy sanctions, what it looks like is China will be getting a lot of open doors and a lot of opportunities, including in Central Asia, sort of to push Russia still a little bit further to the side, at least economically for sure.
All right, and then a question that brings us back to the very beginning of our conversation about freedom of the press. Are there any issues that you need to be careful in Kyrgyzstan about when you are speaking in public? Are there any taboo topics?
There are not necessarily any taboo topics, but certainly there are topics that can lead you into serious troubles. Now, actually, I must correct myself. Legally, it's becoming more and more difficult because the new government has been more restrictive. But things such as nationalism or nationalistically divisive topics is one thing. Another is LGBTQ and sexual diversity, and sometimes, to some extent, maybe anti-Russian material. Those sorts of things can get both official law enforcement reaction, but even more hurtfully, I think, a sharp dissent and critical reaction by one or another group within the society.
Okay, and very briefly, is the poet, if you know anything is not really your specialty, you can feel free to say no, Aitmatov, I hope I'm saying the name right, who wrote The Most Beautiful Love Story, still popular in your country?
Yes, I think he's probably the most popular one name. Well, besides epic hero Manas, he's certainly a national hero, and I think there is more about fame of Aitmatov and less about actual deep knowledge and examination of his writings.
Okay.
I hope that one day we'll be reading more closely what he wrote.
Okay, so we are finally nearing the end of this conversation. Unfortunately, I think you did a wonderful job, Emil, in outlining less known issues regarding Kyrgyzstan political system, geopolitics, social transformation undergone since becoming an independent country after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And now let me just bring in some final standardized questions, which will allow us to end on a slightly lighter note. So could you tell us what is your favorite place and food in Kyrgyzstan?
My favorite place is one place that I've only been once to, shamefully. It's called Sarıçelek. It's a lake, a small lake, very high in the mountains, in a sort of off-the-road region. That's why it's a little difficult to reach, but it's anyone can check maybe from internet. It's one of the most beautiful lakes set right in between high peaks of mountains. My food, plov. I think you may, if you had other Central Asian countries, I'm afraid others will also say this. Plov or palo, this rice-based food. I mean, I think that's the most favorite that I'd like.
Especially your favorite place sounds really idyllic, but I doubt that it's going to be so easy for me to get there. So this brings me to the next question, which might be actually easier for me as well. But what would you recommend us to now at the moment as the best thing to read or to watch about Kyrgyzstan?
To read, you already mentioned Aitmatov. He's probably the most famous, but I'd actually mention something else. There is a novel called Broken Sword by another very famous writer, Soviet-type writer, Tologon Kasambekov. I mean, he died recently, but his novel is a historical novel that actually tells a really good and sad, in a way, story of pre-Soviet Central Asia, set mostly on the Kyrgyz side of Central Asia. I think it's possibly one of the most important historical novels that the Kyrgyzstanis try to read and make sense of.
That sounds like a fascinating read. And the final question for you, do you have a question maybe for the speakers of the next episode of this series on Singapore, which, may I remind you and the public, are an international relations expert and a journalist? You can also just have a question for one of them.
I think both of them would probably be able to answer my question, since you said it would be Singaporeans. Now, Central Asia, as we said, is generally a region of autocracies, and Kyrgyzstan has joined the club recently. Now, Lee Kuan Yew, the great leader of Singapore, is one of the most popular figures, global popular figures, and especially he's been taken as a model to emulate by the Central Asian autocratic and corrupt leaders. And my question to our colleagues from Singapore is, as a Singaporean citizen, what do you feel when you hear that autocrats and corrupt leaders somewhere far away aspire to be their own Lee Kuan Yew's?
Yeah, it's a great question. I look forward to hearing the answer to that in 2 weeks. Right, so once again, as we are unfortunately coming to an end of this interesting discussion, thank you so much for these great insights, Dr. Emilbek Dzhuraev, And thanks to all of you who joined us for this great 8th episode of A Closer Look, as well as for the excellent questions, making the discussion even more lively. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. Everybody have a good day.